those that are detaining, kidnapping, torturing journalists. The Journalist Support Committee was established in 2016 by a group of journalists in the aftermath of the Arab Spring in response to a number of instances of journalists being killed, kidnapped, or forcibly disappeared. The core mission of the Journalist Support Committee is to promote the right to freedom of expression, press freedom, access to information, and defend the right of journalists to report the news without fear of reprisal. There have been many instances recently of many high-profile journalists and whistleblowers, reporters being detained, being tortured, being murdered even in several instances. One of the most notable cases is that of Julian Assange as well. And we're lucky to be joined tonight by Sarah Vivacqua. She's a member of Lawyers for Assange, not part of Assange's defence team, but a group of lawyers who are campaigning for Assange's rights and freedoms. John Kiriakou, former CIA agent and whistleblower, and Professor Niels Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur of Torture, and who released famously a report on Assange, explaining how he, in essence, was being tortured by the conditions that he was being kept in. So we are going to start this evening with some questions for Sarah Vivacqua. So firstly, Sarah, thank you for joining us. To what extent is the Assange case an example or exemplar in terms of how a government can criminalize the publication of truthful information from anonymous sources? And what dangers does it entail for the regular practices of journalism worldwide?
So, Daniel, thank you for having me here in such a fantastic panel, which John and Niels, people that I have been following, and I'm a great admirer, both their courage, competence, and their courage and competence. It's very inspiring for all of us who are in this fight and the fight for human rights. I'm here not only as one of the members, founding members of Lawyers for Assange. I'm always the legal correspondent of Diário do Centro do Mundo in Brazil, an independent press that has been covering the case of Assange. So you asked me two different questions. You asked me, first of all, what the stand of Assange case is emblematic in the way the governments can criminalize journalism. And I think Assange himself has, with his courage and visionary spirit, already posed and answered that very question. I think when he envisaged WikiLeaks, I understand he recognized ahead of his time that torture, mass murder, regime changes, gagging of journalists, lawfare are not the product of violent times and the natural part of human struggle for development. He showed that this was deliberated and still is deliberate and systematic state policy. And I think the treatment of Julian Assange is not coincidentally this very mirror image of all the oppression, injustice he revealed through WikiLeaks. His prosecution is an account of torture as a state policy, the weaponization of state powers and judicial system for private vendetta, extraordinary rendition, extrajudicial killing by senior officials, unlawful mass surveillance, coup attempts, corruption. This is a state policy. This is very much state policy. And it's all begins with this image that nobody can take out of their minds, which is the shooting of two Reuters journalists by an American helicopter. The military language will deceitfully call these deaths as collateral damage, but we know that in fact Assange showed irrefutably that this is cold-blooded state murder. And I think right now I would like to draw the attention that not only journalists have been prosecuted, but even lawyers are under the same, are being criminalized. We had Lula's lawyer their office has been invaded by the Ministry of Justice in Brazil. We had the same here with Assange defense lawyers in an even more extreme case. And right now we have the environmental and human rights lawyers in America, Stephen Donziger. He's been kept silent in an American federal prison after a year-long battle with the oil company Chevron. In 2011, Donziger, he won an 18 billion US dollar settlement against Chevron on behalf of 30,000 indigenous peoples in Ecuador for dumping 16 billion gallons of oil into the ancestral land in the Amazon. And a New York federal judge employed a private law firm linked to Chevron to prosecute him. He sits now in jail, in a federal jail in America. And I think whoever attempts to show the unlimited greed, depravity, perversity of the capitalist ruling elites and how far they can go against an enemy, I think this is the reality of brave journalism, of brave lawyers, and this is the message that is being reinforced with the persecution of Julian Assange. And I think to your second questions that you asked me about the danger, what kind of dangers does it entail for the regular practice of journalism worldwide? I think we need to begin by the very fact that there is no crime under American law for Assange's action. There is no crime under any democratic constitution that has freedom of expression as a fundamental right. There is no such crime. Assange prosecution is incompatible with any rule of law and with any constitution of the post-war era. So what I mean by that is that receiving, encouraging, publishing information are typical journalist activities, and they are protected in particular under the American Constitution, which has a very wide understanding of freedom of expression, far more than even, for instance, the German Constitution. So Assange never signed any confidentiality agreement with an American authority, never had direct access to the information he published from whistleblowers. So even so, if we are talking about criminalizing journalistic sources, we need to remember that state confidentiality is not an absolute right, it's not an absolute seal, and it's not its legal purpose to conceal state crimes, only secrets, but not crimes. And if torture, genocide, illegal state policy are being concealed under the cloak of state confidentiality, we have the right to know. And the state has the duty to disclose. And this is tradition reinvents the law to frontally assault the freedom of press, the freedom of expression, and our right to know, and give the status to the US government of the editor of the truth in the world. So this tradition on the base of the indictment would really gravely endanger the freedom of press, which is a cornerstone of democracy, which is also enshrined in Article 10 of ECHR. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a fantastic way to open this panel, and yeah, really lays out the facts and the implications of the case. And yeah, you mentioned it's not a crime. You know, it's incompatible with democratic states. But it does seem the US has one rule for others and another rule for itself, particularly in the way that Assange's extradition has been pursued. So we have the very dodgy circumstances where Sweden was attempting to extradite him from Britain, and Assange quite sensibly and probably correctly feared that any extradition to Sweden would then be followed by an extradition from Sweden to the US. Then that Sweden case was dropped, and now they're attempting to directly extradite him from the UK to the US. But what basis does this have in international law? How is this legal? And if so, you know, is there something we need to change in international law to fix this for the sake of freedom of expression and freedom of journalism?
Is this question directed to me?
Yes. Sorry.
No, I think we don't need to change any laws. I think we just need to follow laws. It's often said that we need to change laws. I will leave it for those wanting. I think we have very strong constitutional and international agreements which are being marginalized by the political elites, the political ruling class. I think we just need to protect what we have. Of course, tribunals, they need to have the freedom to decide the right way. And they need to know the truth to decide the right way. And that's where the journalist comes. We need the facts, and then we give the law, and we need the truth to come out. I think what we need is the truth and the application of law. I don't see any immediate need for changing the laws in order to protect. There might be punctual changes that are needed, but the general speech that the laws are useless and that the international contracts are useless is just a way to, again, assault the public and the state, and to discredit democracy.
Fantastic, thank you. And this is something we would associate maybe with, there's many other nations that imprison and torture journalists. The case of Jamal Khashoggi being a notable one, where Saudi Arabia murdered him in their embassy in Turkey. But it's not something we would necessarily associate or think of when it comes to what we call democratic Western nations like Britain, like America, etc. Do you see a fundamental difference between the Assange case and what happens to journalists in other countries where they're imprisoned and tortured simply for reporting on what's going on?
So my understanding is that the prosecution and imprisonment of independent journalists has been escalated in the last 20 years. And but I don't think Assange is, unfortunately, I don't think he's an exception. He's just an extreme case. He just denounces extreme cases. And I think you don't need a dictatorship to implement authoritarian rules. So Julian Assange's case, in my opinion, shows that authoritarian regimes or regime change is not necessary for the implementation of authoritative measures. So this is actually a phenomenon that is studied by different scholars around the world and receives different names. Some call it liquid authoritarianism, but I think irrespective of the terminology, they all indicate the same idea, that through the application of exceptional measures in law, of enactment of exception laws, or even just by the exception interpretation of law, in particular in criminal law, democracy is dismantled from within by its own means, and it slowly implodes civil rights and constitutions. So the implementation of exception measures of the law began, for instance, in our times with the war on drugs, in particularly in post-colonial countries like in Brazil. So the war on drugs are a way to introduce extreme measures to prosecute the most villains, and people will agree with that because you get an exceptional case to implement exception law, and then you apply to the general public. And this was then potentialized in the form of the war on terror, which was giving full authority to develop itself under the fragments and the debris of the 9/11. So there is one intellectual, he's called Heinrich Geisenberger, and he says that the recent attacks on the US Capitol was a case of liquid authoritarianism in action. And I'll quote something that he says. He says, "The Nazi movement itself was still in a liquid stage in 1923, before it solidified organizationally and institutionally in the 20s and in the 30s. The states of matter can change into different compounds from solid to liquid to gas and the other way around." So this is Heinrich Geiselberg. And I think that it takes many forms of authoritarianism, but it succeeds as much as it can suppress critical thinking. I personally say I think austerity measures are homemade dedicated measures of liquid authoritarianism, because it deprives people from their basic needs of our physical existence, and it deprives psychological ability to exist, because we no longer can envisage a future. And it reduces us to the sheer, immediate, and self-preserving thinking. So I don't think it's a prerogative of how far right politics or authoritarian regimes operate. On the contrary, and I think Assange demonstrated all too well that the semantics does not require oneself to call himself as a fascist, that this type of liquid authoritarianism will infiltrate the system, the institutions, the language. We use the language of democracy, of progress, and will fragment common grounds, basic ideas of society. And so what I think is that the perception that if you have a functioning democracy and a functioning constitutions, those things will not happen. Julian Assange's case came to deny this and to show how authoritarianism can infiltrate, even can breach consent, the consent of the civil rights. So I think in this case, Julian Assange case it's not, and unfortunately, it's not an exception. If we follow the trial, we would see the Guantanamo Bay, that imprisonment and torture is a state policy. We're going to see that gagging journalists is a state policy, that a victim of torture could not speak as a witness statement, or there was resistance from the judge from a victim of which El Masri testimony was not, the judge was preventing this testimony to be read in court. So I think Julian Assange case opens and blows every lie that is told to us and shows what is the reality, just like Julian Assange did with his revelations.
Thank you, Sarah. Some very powerful points in there and beautifully elucidated. It's just a shame that the subject is so scary. Unfortunately, we couldn't be joined this evening by Dr. Valeska Martins. We send her our best wishes, but she has written a book called Lawfare, Waging War Through Law, particularly on the case of the persecution of Brazilian President Lula. Could you just tell us a little bit about your understanding of lawfare, and is this a phenomenon that's increasing in frequency and severity, that using the law to unfairly target and persecute people, including journalists and even major political candidates?
So I'm not a specialist on lawfare, but I was historic testimony of this lawfare in my country, in Brazil, when it was used to imprison a president, the former President Lula, and to criminalize many others in the Brazilian Labour Party. And this was the same used in Bolivia, used in Ecuador, used in Argentina. So if before the Americans and the CIA would come and support authoritarian regimes, now they don't need to. They have a new form of imperialism, which is lawfare. And the lawfare has a very, an aspect, does not necessarily have, but has the aspect that it could be a threat to sovereignty as well, not only for the civil rights of a person, sovereignty of a state, where you have the DOJ prosecuting Brazilians and breaking the legs of Brazilians companies, productive companies, instead of just taking out the people who are being corrupt. And we know this is a wide strategy. The DOJ uses this as a tool of imperialism. This has been studied since the 70s, especially I think the French studied quite well how lawfare can be used as a weapon of imperialism and to destroy local companies. So I can only speak as a person who has followed recently events in Latin America, and lawfare is just so much of a reality. But I think that Lula's case, as much as the Assange's case, showed something that also already exists in our criminal system, because the Brazilian criminal system is incarcerating mainly 70% of them are Black and poor. So in a way, Lula, the former union trade leader, he is just show the anger that ruling class in Brazil has towards poor people. And actually Lula, there's many Lulas sitting on jail right now, sometimes for robbery because they are hungry. Famine leads to a lot of robbery. Some people rob old food for famine and they get to jail for 1 year. I worked for a little while in the public defense office in Brazil, and we had cases of people 2 years incarceration for stealing 3 DVDs of £1 each, like old DVDs, and people incarcerated for stealing food, when those actually should not ever be prosecuted, because there is no public interest in prosecuting those things. So I think lawfare, it's far more common than we think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Please stay with us. We'll come back to you a little bit later. We now have coming up a video from Bahraini journalist Ahmed Radi. He's a member of Journalist Support Committee, nominated for a UNESCO Guillermo Cano World Press Freedom Prize 2018, and a former prisoner of conscience, tortured and prevented from travelling. So before we go to that video, though, I've just received breaking news that Steve Sweeney, the international editor of the Morning Star, a British newspaper, has been arrested in Mexico. He was on his way to cover the elections in Nicaragua. We'll maybe discuss that in a little bit more detail with John Kiriakou if we get some more details on that arrest. But now this video from Ahmed Radi.
السيدة والسادة المحترمين والضيوف الكرام، أشكركم لإتاحة الفرصة للتعبير عن صوت الصحفيين الذين يعانون أوضاعا سيئة في بلدانهم. كصحفي وإعلامي معتقل سابق من البحرين، اعتقلت عدة مرات وتم منعي من السفر مرارا، وتعرضت للتعذيب البدني والنفسي أدى لإصابتي بأزمة قلبية وضيق التنفس وضعف النظر، كما فقدت السمع في إحدى أذناي بسبب الضرب المتواصل. وكان سبب اعتقالي هو نشاطي الإعلامي وتواصلي مع وسائل الإعلام الخارجية. النظام في البحرين يفرض العديد من الإجراءات المقيدة لحرية التعبير عن الرأي، ويهيمن على جميع وسائل الإعلام، ويخضع وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي للرقابة والمنع، ويقوم بتوظيف تقنيات الرقابة والتصنت وبرامج التجسس على النشطاء عبر شركات أجنبية. لذلك أقصى ما نطالب به كصحفيين وإعلاميين هو تمكين الضحايا من محاسبة معذبيهم والقتلة ممن ثبت قيامهم بجرائم وانتهاكات خطيرة، وإلغاء قانون 56 الذي يعفي المعذبين من محاسبتهم أمام المحاكم، والسماح لمقرر الأمم المتحدة لزيارة البحرين واستطلاع أوضاعها الحقوقية ومدى التزامها بالتشريعات والمواثيق والمعاهدات الدولية، والعمل على تشريع قانون يحمي الإعلاميين من الاعتقال والتعذيب، أو قانون صحافة متطور أسوة بالدول الديمقراطية، وإطلاق سراح سجناء الرأي من الإعلاميين والمصورين والمدونين والنشطاء الإلكترونيين، ووقف كافة أشكال التهديد والمضايقات ضدهم. شكرا لحسن استماعكم.
Very powerful reminder of the real human impact that these laws and these injustices have. So we are lucky to be joined by real-life CIA man, John Kiriakou, former CIA agent and who has written a best-selling book, The Reluctant Spy, My Secret Life in the CIA's War on Terror. He was senior intelligence advisor to Committee Chairman Senator John Kerry and former consultant for counter-terrorism. Thank you for joining us, John.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Sarah mentioned a couple of times, it came up, mentions of the CIA and Latin America. Latin America is often regarded as the US's back door, but obviously the CIA operates globally. And one of the most incredible, unbelievable, possibly things to come out recently about the Assange case was of a US plot to potentially either kidnap or assassinate Assange. They were looking into the feasibility of essentially removing him one way or another when he left the Ecuadorian embassy. And the British government colluded with this. The British government was discussing these talks. As an ex-CIA officer, does this story have any credibility? Do you think that there was any possibility that they might have gone through with such a plan? And if so, does it affect the ongoing case to extradite Assange?
I think the answer to all of those questions is a resounding yes. This was a serious plot to kidnap or kill Julian Assange. Julian Assange cannot possibly receive a fair trial anywhere in the United States, let alone in the notorious Eastern District of Virginia, which is known colloquially here as the Espionage Court, because it is the home district court to the CIA. Let me explain quickly how this insanity could have come to pass. Anybody in the CIA, at least on the operational side of the CIA, can propose something called a covert action plan. Now, this is an offensive plan that is so secret that just the concept of it is classified above the top secret level. So if I were in operations in the CIA, I could go to this covert action staff and say, I have an idea, and my idea is to either kidnap or kill Julian Assange. So they put it into the proper format, into a memo, and they send it to the CIA's Office of General Counsel. The General Counsel determines if it is legal within the congressionally mandated authorities, is what they're called, authorities that the CIA has. They'll always say yes. And then it goes to the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. Now, the Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, is supposed to be the final determinant of whether a covert action is legal. Now, clearly, murdering an Australian national in the streets of Knightsbridge is illegal. The man's never been convicted of a crime. He's not faced his accusers in a court of law. He's not been before a jury of his peers. But OLC is also the same organization that legalized the American Torture Program, that legalized the International Extraordinary Rendition Program, that legalized this archipelago of secret prisons around the world that the United States had. And so the Office of Legal Counsel apparently approved this plan to capture or to kill Julian. Then it goes to the National Security Council General Counsel, and their lawyers at the White House rubber stamp OLC's decision. Now, here's where it fell apart. It then goes to the National Security Advisor, who normally would sign it and then send it to the president for his signature. Once the president signs it, it becomes something called a presidential finding, where it's secret. It's actually above top secret, but it has the power and authority of law because the president has signed it. It appears, and we know this from 30 separate sources that reported on this operation, 30 former CIA officers and National Security Council officials. It appears that the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, read it and said, this is insane and it's illegal and we're not going to do it. Now, one of the things that the US press has missed, because this story really was not carried in the mainstream media. Of course, it appeared in Yahoo News and then disappeared after a day. But what the Yahoo News article said in one single sentence was that this plan to capture or kill Julian began in 2009 under the Obama administration. It began with John Brennan, who was the deputy national security advisor at the time and then later became the CIA director. This was not a plan that came out of the crazy Trump people and the crazy Trump White House. This was that great lover of freedom, Saint Barack Obama. So we have to remember that this is not a partisan issue in the United States. Leaders of both parties want to harm Julian Assange because he has embarrassed them consistently by outing their illegal activities and their war against human rights, civil rights, and civil liberties. I really believe that it's as simple as that.
Oh, thank you, John. And where do you think the balance is between state secrets, obviously having to keep some things for security purposes secret, and what is in the public interest? Daniel Hale was recently sentenced to 2 years, I think, in prison.
45 months.
45 months for revealing that 90% of the targets of US drone strikes are not the intended targets. Whether or not the intended targets are legitimate or not is another question, but even the proclaimed targets of these drone strikes are not being hit by them. So massive human casualties from this drone strike program. Surely that's something that's in the interest of the American people to know what their tax money is being spent on and what is being done in their name.
You're absolutely right. And interestingly enough, the laws are already on the books. It's just that our government has chosen to ignore the law. It is illegal in the United States. It is a felony in the United States to classify something that is a crime. You are not permitted to put a secret or top secret classification on something that is against the law. Well, using torture as an example, we have the 1946 Federal Torture Act, which specifically barred exactly those techniques that were later used by CIA officers. In 1946, we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American prisoners of war. We executed them. That was a death penalty crime. In 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. This was January 11th, 1968. On the morning that that photograph ran, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was charged with torture and convicted, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Well, the law never changed. The law was never amended. We changed. So my question then, even if it's a rhetorical one, is why was torture illegal in 1946 and illegal in 1968, but then somehow magically legal in 2002? It's because we just chose to begin ignoring the laws that we didn't like, or ignoring the laws that didn't fit into whatever US policy happened to be the policy of the day. So number one, we have to respect the laws. We like to tell the rest of the world that we are a shining beacon of hope for human rights and civil liberties. And indeed, the State Department prepares a congressionally mandated human rights report every single year on every country that with which we have diplomatic relations around the world. I know because I was 2 years in Bahrain. I was the human rights officer there, and I reported on Bahraini human rights violations. But the problem that we have in everyday life is when a human rights officer like I go into a Minister of Interior's office around the world and say, Your Excellency, you can't arrest journalists. You can't beat them. You can't torture them. And then the CIA station chief comes in an hour later and says, don't listen to the human rights guy. We want you to open a secret prison where we can bring prisoners and we're going to torture them there, but don't tell anybody. So what does that do? That utterly undermines respect for human rights, and it undermines the government of the United States. So Daniel Hale was right. The American people have a right to know what their government is doing in their name. The American people have a right to know when the laws are being violated ostensibly for them. But our government doesn't want us to know those things. And to me, those are basic elements of a functioning democracy.
Thanks, John. That's something the West says it's very proud of is the free press, and often compares itself to other countries in that regard. But yeah, it certainly seems like we do not have a very free press if the penalty for reporting on serious issues like these is so high. Is it your sense from your experience as an ex-CIA officer, is it your sense that the CIAs and the secret services of the US are also being deployed a lot against its own citizens as well as foreign nationals?
Here in the United States, certainly the FBI is regularly and routinely deployed against its own citizens. We have, for example, very recent evidence of citizens being set up in Michigan and in Portland, Oregon, where they've been entrapped by the FBI. There was a terrible case in Cleveland, Ohio, where the FBI didn't like the politics of these three young men. And so they recruited a fourth young man to approach them and say, hey, let's blow up the Route 82 bridge. That would be so much fun. I have the explosives and I have the detonators. Let's just go do it. We'll have some fun. They went and planted the explosives, which were inert, of course, and the detonator was provided by the FBI and it was inert. They never had any thoughts of blowing up the Route 82 bridge until this FBI informant tricked them into doing it. The three of them were arrested and were sentenced on terrorism charges to sentences of 20, 25, and 30 years. Well, that's entrapment, and that's what the FBI does when they don't like people's individual politics. The CIA does this against foreign nationals whom they don't like. You know, Julian Assange is obviously the clearest, most obvious example of this persecution and harassment at the hands of the CIA. And I'm glad you brought this up because I want to raise something that I think is a very important point that the media haven't addressed. And it's coming out of the appeal last week of Julian Assange's extradition situation. And that is that the Justice Department prosecutors have promised that Julian would not be placed in a communications management unit or in solitary confinement. That's just simply a lie. It's not up to the prosecutors to decide who goes to solitary confinement or who goes to a communications management unit. It's up to the Bureau of Prisons. And there are magic words that anybody can utter in prison that would send Julian to solitary. And that is, I heard somebody threaten Julian. That's it. Any prisoner can walk up to any prison guard and say they heard somebody threaten Julian Assange, and Julian would be taken immediately, and I mean immediately, and placed in solitary confinement, ostensibly for his own protection. That's all they have to say. You know, so many of us, Daniel Hale, Jeffrey Sterling, Terry Albury, the FBI whistleblower, and I challenged the circumstances of our own confinement, and we're told, too bad. It's the Bureau of Prisons that decides who serves their time where and who goes to solitary. And if you complain too much, you go to solitary. So this notion that some lawyers or talking heads from the Department of Justice can mandate that Julian not go to solitary, that's just simply a lie.
Fantastic. Thank you, John, for your expert opinion and experience there. It's very valuable to understand just how these things work in practice. Coming up next, we have Professor Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. But first, we have a video contribution from Ruba Shibib, a Palestinian journalist who's been covering international media for Gaza since 2018, and member of Women Empowerment Projects for US Palestinian Affairs in the UN Department.
I'm Ruba Shabbat, a Palestinian journalist based in the Gaza Strip. I would like to talk about the suffering of the Palestinian journalists, especially in the Gaza Strip in time of conflicts. According to the international community and human rights groups, journalists all over the world should be provided with protection and security, but this is not the case here for Palestinian journalists. I would like to talk in specific about the latest escalation against Gaza Strip, the 2021 escalation. Journalists, Palestinian journalists, were a direct target for the Israeli regime and attacks and missiles, and their media offices and outlets were really a direct target as well for getting bombed or hit. We have 41 media institutions in the Gaza Strip that was totally destroyed and collapsed to the ground during the latest escalation, and others were partially damaged, leaving the Palestinian journalists working in these media offices in chaos. I would like to talk about my experiences as well, me and my colleagues, while covering incidents by the borders and clashes and even peaceful protests by the separation fence. Even while wearing our press vest, we were a direct target for the tear gas and live bullets. And I would like also to talk that 13 Palestinian journalists are under arrest inside Israeli jail still now, without trial or any charge, but for being a Palestinian journalist. And I guess that this is attempts from the Israeli side to block the truth from being conveyed to the world. And there is that suffering for Palestinian journalists and restrictions in movement, as most of Palestinian journalists are not allowed to travel or have freely movement, whether to attend international workshops or international trainings or meetings talking about journalism in Palestine. This is because Israel is trying to isolate Palestinian community in general from the world. As a journalist, I call on the international community and all human groups to hold Israel accountable for these crimes and violations against Palestinian journalists.
A very powerful reminder of how important the freedom of press, freedom of speech is to people across the world there, from Palestinian journalist Ruba Shabbat. We have further news on the UK journalist Steve Sweeney, international editor of the UK socialist daily Morning Star. He says he's been placed in police custody as he was transferring flights in Mexico City on his way to cover the elections in Nicaragua. The Journalist Support Committee condemns this behaviour. Obviously, members of the press should be free and must be free to cover elections, especially when there is any kind of doubt or controversy over them. In the case of the Nicaraguan elections, it's important to have international observers and reporters there to explain what is actually happening on the ground. Now, we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Niels Meltzer, the UN Special Reporter on Torture, who visited Julian Assange in 2019 and delivered a verdict that he was, in fact, being tortured. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Thank you very much. Am I unmuted?
Yep, hearing you loud.
Okay, very well.
Could you please outline for us what you believe to be Assange's psychological torture at the hands of Britain and USA? Has his state deteriorated while he's been pursued by the US and by Britain?
Yes, well, I visited during Assange just after his expulsion and expulsion from the Ecuadorian embassy on the 11th of April 2019, and then obviously his arrest by the British police and his imprisonment in Belmarsh. So I visited him about 4 weeks later on the 9th of May 2019 in Belmarsh. And I took two experienced doctors with me, a forensic who used to be the president of the World Forensic Society, who has been examining torture victims and victims of war crimes for 30 years. I've taken also a psychiatrist with me who headed a torture victim rehabilitation center. So two specialized experts who have been accompanying me on prison visits around the world, just to be sure that we get an objective assessment. I did that because I felt the Assange case was so politicized that it was very important to have objective scientific data. And so we spent 4 hours examining him. I had a bilateral discussion with him in prison, and each of the doctors separately from each other examined him. And then we compared notes, and all the three of us. And I have visited, I'm not a doctor, I'm a lawyer, but I've visited, prisoners of war and so on for 20 years, and political prisoners. And we all the three of us came to the conclusion that he showed all the symptoms, medical symptoms that are typical for victims of long-term psychological torture. Now, I can't reveal the precise diagnosis because it's of the medical confidentiality, but by and large, what we're talking about is an extremely elevated level of stress, of anxiety, not the type of stress and anxiety you would usually see in a prisoner being prosecuted, which is a stressful situation, but we're talking about the stress level that prevents the person from sleeping around the clock. So basically, all they have is they doze off for a couple of minutes, and then they wake up again, and they're panicked, and it's this kind of alternating states of extreme anxiety and extreme depression, and that destabilizes the personality, which is obviously the aim of psychological torture. Now, psychological torture, it's important to understand, is not torture light. It is actually was invented as a systematic method by the Nazis when they were not able to break resistance fighters in Eastern Europe physically. They found that psychological torture was even more effective. So they were actually the first ones to systematically develop that because it was more effective, more cruel, even than physical torture. I think it's important to understand that, and because it's also very often underestimated in its cruelty. And the elements of psychological torture really are, alternating, but in priority, but it's always a bit the same elements. So first of all, you need a threat scenario, the fear in the victim, and then the isolated, physically or socially, just isolated from all sources of positive input, because we're social beings. We can stay alone for a couple of days, but when in prolonged periods, it actually degrades our identity. So threat scenario, isolation, and then the creation of an arbitrary environment where social conventions no longer apply. And social conventions is not just about niceties and being polite, it's also about the law, which are social conventions, rules that apply. So when I want to avail myself of my rights, and then I expect those rights to be respected and protected. And in his case, I've investigated the case for 2 years, and I can say for the last decade, in 4 jurisdictions, Sweden, Great Britain, US, and Ecuador, Julian Assange's rights have been systematically violated in all jurisdictions, at all levels of all judicial proceedings, at every stage of those proceedings. And I have clear evidence from that I have published. And so that's the arbitrariness, where he knows he cannot rely on his rights, on the law being applied. Also what John and Sarah just referred to before. And the fourth element that adds to it is humiliation. So the identity and the self-confidence of the person is systematically being degraded through defamation, spreading of derogatory narratives, and so on. And we all know the narrative that has been spread about Julian Assange. And what's very important is, in his case, none of the things that he's being accused of, I'm saying none of them, have been proven, ever. I mean, from that most petty accusations of not feeding his cat, up to rape allegations, espionage, and endangering people. None of it has been. There's no evidence for any of that. So all those elements over the course of the years in his isolation in that embassy, that obviously was a friendly place in the beginning, but very quickly became a trap. And then after the change of government in Quito, in Ecuador, when we had America-friendly President Moreno coming in that wanted him out of the embassy, it became a place of harassment. And so that really created a torturous environment that then caused those symptoms. And yes, his state of health has deteriorated. On the day we visited him, my doctors warned me, and I then warned the authorities, the British authorities, that if his situation was not stabilized quickly, he would deteriorate in a downward spiral. And lo and behold, 9 days after our visit, he was no longer able to participate in his court hearing, and he had to be transferred to the medical department of the prison.
Thanks, Niels. In your opinion, has the conditions that he's experienced, have they been deliberately imposed in order to torture him, do you think? Or is it just a byproduct of them wanting to detain and persecute him?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking for that clarification. And I think it's very important. It's a good opportunity to set the record straight about what torture really is. Torture, most people have this image of an interrogation situation in their minds when we speak of torture. And that is actually not true. I mean, that obviously does happen very often in order to coerce confessions and try to force people to either remain silent or to say whatever one wants to hear. But interrogators, by and large, know that torture really is a lousy method of establishing the truth, because the victim will say anything just to make it stop. The biggest or the most important purpose and practice of torture is to demonstrate power and to intimidate not only the victim, but especially other people, family members, members of the same political party, members of the same profession. Here we're talking about journalists, and that is absolutely clearly the purpose of what is being done to Julian Assange, is not to punish him primarily. Well, there's an element of that, but states are much more unemotional than that. They're very deliberate because they're creating this precedent. And even without his extradition to the US, the past 10 years, journalists the world over have been observing what's happening to Julian Assange. It has been happening to him for 10 years. And that precedent is working already. They have set an example with him. Look, if you ever disclose our dirty secrets to the world, this is what we're going to do to you. We're going to violate your rights at every step of the path, and nobody will be able to protect you. And if regularly, when I talk to audiences, and I think our audience today is perhaps a good opportunity as well, I'm just asking the question to you. If I gave you a USB stick today with all those information that Chelsea Manning passed to Julian Assange at the time, would you publish them today? Having seen what happens to Julian Assange, as a journalist, what would you do with them? And I'm sure that even those publication partners that worked with Julian Assange at the time, New York Times and so on, that they would no longer do that today. We know from the New York Times, they have admitted publicly that they actually get their national security relevant articles cleared by the White House.
So in essence, it's almost already had the intended effect. Even if he's not extradited to the US, the treatment, the torture of Assange has had a massive chilling effect on journalism. I suppose what we can hope for is getting justice for Assange and other whistleblowers and journalists will start to reverse that trend, hopefully. You've written a lot of statements detailing the psychological torture of Assange by Britain and the US in violation of international law and democratic norms. Why haven't these governments taken any notice? Is this a sign of the UN's weakness, or does it say more about Britain and the US acting as rogue agents, essentially?
Well, I think they have taken notice. You can be sure of that. But I think it shows, the UN is as strong or as weak as its members have designed the organization to be. Because the UN is nothing separate from states. It's an organization of states created by states for states. And especially the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, including obviously the UK and the US, they dominate absolutely everything in the United Nations. So I'm lucky as a special rapporteur. I enjoy hierarchical and political independence. So no one, even the Secretary General of the UN, cannot give me any instructions. The flip side of it is that whatever I determine is an expert opinion, but it is not binding on those states. Now, what is binding is the Anti-Torture Convention, or the human rights, is due process. And I have clearly found evidence that all of those principles and rules have been gravely violated in this case. But when you're facing the most powerful state in the world, there's just no way to enforce it, unfortunately. Now, I think several speakers today have already shown and spoken to that it's a much bigger issue than just the case of Julian Assange as an individual. It is really it shows is that we are in a global governance crisis today, about 200 years after we've gotten rid of absolutist rule, and we've created democracies, rule of law, the separation of powers. And in that system, it's important to remember that journalism, the media, its role is not to entertain people. It is the fourth estate. It's the fourth power in the state, and its mandate and its function is to empower people to observe the other three governmental powers and then to report to the public whether the Constitution is being respected and the rule of law is being respected. And if not, then it empowers the population to actually use its democratic powers to correct that. And that's exactly what the mainstream media has increasingly failed to do. No, not least because large parts of that media is owned by the same people that finance election campaigns and that influence through that also court decisions and so on. Or they're depending on the private industries because of their marketing, revenues and so on, and commercials. So here's where WikiLeaks comes in and fills that gap. Has it done it perfectly? Perhaps it's open to criticism, but we can talk about this in a civilized manner. But the function is essential, that we as the people are being informed about how our governments are spending the money we're paying to them in our taxes and the power we delegate to them. And because that, through the WikiLeaks approach, threatens the secrecy of those established powers and basically tries to reinforce the democratic principles. And that's why they're being so persecuted, because it actually threatens the business model of those intelligence agencies and kind of this parallel universe that threatens the rule of law and democracies the world around. And so I think really what this is about is this is the big context, and those powerful states just don't want to be challenged by WikiLeaks, and especially because they're afraid that others will follow their example. And this idea will proliferate, which is easy with internet today. And if you have 15,000 WikiLeaks tomorrow, that's the end of secrecy. And perhaps the beginning of democracy.
Very concerning outlook. How do you fight this? How are you fighting the persecution of Assange, of these other journalists, and how do you recommend people can get involved? What can ordinary people do? What can journalists do to fight back against this?
Look, I think we all have to have, where we are in our lives, we have to understand what this is about. It's not primarily about Julian Assange. Yes, it is about him as a person. It's about his family and everything. There is the individual aspect. But what this really is about, and why the US and the UK and Sweden and other states are spending, dozens of millions to persecute him. This is really, it's not because of bail violation. Seriously, let's be real. This is about our rights. It's about our right to know. It's about our right to oversee governments. And we, wherever we are in our lives, whether we're journalists or UN functions, or what, we have to take this seriously and on our spots fight it. This threat that tries to get rid and suppress our right to know. I'm a rapporteur, which means I'm reporting to the United Nations, to the public. I'm trying to empower, in my way, to empower the public to know what's going on, and for them then to use their democratic rights to influence, their politicians and the governments and their companies and whatever, in order to ensure that the democratic foundations and the rule of law, which all of us and our children will depend on in the future, that this is preserved.
Thank you so much, Niels. I think that's a fantastic way to look at it, and inspire people to get involved, to start fighting back against this. We have a few questions coming in for the panel now. Anyone can jump in and answer if you'd like. Would guests be able to comment on the persecution of Craig Murray? That's another case. He was obviously very well known for reporting on the trial of Assange, and he also reported on the trial of Alex Salmond, which has led to him serving a jail sentence for what's called jigsaw identification. He was the only one persecuted for that. The court claimed that reading his articles and piecing that together with other information, people would be able to figure out the identities of the not victims, as the case was lost, but the accusers of Craig Murray. The accusers of Alex Salmond. So what's your thoughts on that case? Is that another politically motivated case? Sarah, would you have any thoughts on that?
I think I don't know the case. I haven't read the case to emit an opinion, but I know Craig Murray, while we were campaigning for Assange, he had been followed by two men in his hotel room, and he had been receiving, he had been intimidated. It would not surprise me if this is a political motivated, because it's not for a diplomat to be defending Julian Assange. It's not for someone who belonged to the British establishment to be showing what the establishment is capable of. It wouldn't surprise me at all, knowing his work and know what it was going on the backgrounds while we were campaigning for Assange that had been happening to him.
May I add something to that as well? I agree with Sarah. This was clearly, obviously, an attempt to silence Craig Murray. Craig Murray has been an outspoken supporter of Julian Assange because he had been a high-ranking member of the British foreign policy establishment. This is embarrassing to the British government. They've asked him repeatedly to stop talking and to stop writing. They even offered him earlier in his career an ambassadorship if he would stop talking about torture. And instead, he chose the hard road where he did the right thing. So this is a way of punishing him. And the reason that I say that too is because his sentence was far beyond what the recommended sentence was for a crime, I use air quotes around, as minor as this was. This was the only way that they could get him to stop talking and to stop writing. And it was to gin up a criminal case against him and to incarcerate him.
Thank you, John. And in your opinion, this detaining of the UK journalist in Mexico on the way to report on the elections of Nicaragua, is that something that the US, you think, is normally involved in these kind of things, manipulating reporting and elections in Latin American countries?
Yes, the US frequently is involved in this kind of thing, but I would add something in this case, because this is a British journalist we're talking about. The US does not, it cannot act against a British national without the acquiescence of the British MI6. Because the UK and US are both Five Eyes countries, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They don't spy on each other. They essentially open all of their files to one another. They operate almost as one unit. And so for a British journalist to be detained like this, most likely at the request of the United States, it has to have been done jointly at the request of the British government. This doesn't surprise me at all.
Thank you, Sean. Niels, are you concerned that there's a two-tier system of justice emerging with some people treated differently under the law?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, both of those cases, obviously, I haven't investigated. I know Craig Murray myself, and I greatly respect him for his publications, and that are some of the most reliable sources that I have encountered, apart from official documents. But what we can see, and it speaks to this issue of lawfare, which is really about weaponizing the law for ulterior purposes, for political purposes, really. I mean, this is what we see in the Assange case, from the way those rape allegations have been abused by the Swedish authorities, to persecute Assange too. Well, I mean, John is now on the panel, right? I mean, he's the only CIA agent who has ever been prosecuted in relation to a official torture program because he exposed it. And it's the whistleblowers that are being prosecuted. And I don't, because it is for political purposes, it's not a prosecution, it's a persecution. And you can also see it in this absolutely outrageous sentences, that these people are being threatened, from Chelsea Manning, who received 35 years. I mean, in The Hague, in the War Crimes Tribunal, you get 35 years for genocide or something like this. I mean, and those who committed the war crimes are not even being prosecuted. And so what we can really, I mean, it's so transparent, really. It's so grotesque that it's not even a secret anymore. It's so obvious that this is about protecting established power and persecuting and threatening everybody into submission who's trying to challenge that, to expose that. And so that is really a very, I think it's one of the last bastions that we have against the return of an absolutist rule, not of the 17th century or the 18th century, but of the 21st century, which is a different design. But what it essentially is, it's a small oligarchy that dominates everything and dominates already the three established powers of government in most countries around the world, even the democratic ones, through the business relations and so on, the privatization and so on. And the whistleblowers in connection with journalists are actually taking their profession seriously are kind of the last bastion that prevents them from taking absolute power. And unrestricted power. And so it is really important that we speak truth to power, that we use our functions, our liberties that we still have, as long as we still have them, to defend this, because that is the essence of a free society.
There's a big trend of powerful individuals, wealthy individuals buying up media corporations, notably Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, as well as state-run media organizations like the BBC in Britain. Sarah, do you think that's a cause for concern, this backlash against independent journalism and the cementing of journalism only for big business and governments?
I think Assange has brought up this issue before. I don't know, am I on mute? No. So I think Assange has brought this up before. And I recall vividly he's talking about the freedom of expression today needs to be understood from the perspective of the distribution. So if you have powerful families controlling and monopolies of the media, this is a distributional problem. If you have social media self-regulating themselves. We also have a censorship and a distribution problem. So he basically creates a relationship between censorship and distribution. And I think it's absolute genius how he established this relationship. It's true, because who should be saying what is true and not true are the facts, and at the very most, the courts. So I think Assange talked about we also participating in that. When we are feeding social media our own data, we are working for them. We are working for free. We are depositing our thoughts. We are depositing our intimate thoughts, sometimes our private thoughts, our pictures. And there is a penetration beyond ourselves, because people can tag me, people can put pictures of me. There's a lot being said about us that we don't know it's being said. And I think we have a problem of privacy with that. And we also have a second problem, is the problem of censorship, because today we have Twitter, Facebook, and all others, Google saying what we should read, what we should think. They have records of things, of our thoughts. We don't even have those records. So I think freedom of expression today, we should be discussing distribution and regulation, and not self-regulation. It's not up to corporations to regulate themselves, just like they are doing in the COP26 right now, proposing ideas for them to self-regulate. We are the ones who have the power to say what is legit or not through our constitution. And I think we should amplify the debate about freedom of press, freedom of expression, in those terms.
Thank you, Sarah. And John, the US secret agencies use the media quite a lot to publish their own propaganda, to destabilize nations, to pave the way for acceptance of war. What do you think would be an effective way to combat this?
Oh, the only way to combat it in the legal system here is through robust congressional oversight. But we don't really have that anymore. We haven't had it for a very long time. You're right, though. You know, we have evidence, and I'm going to give one example. We have evidence that the mainstream media here really is in the pocket of the CIA. And I say that based on a recent Freedom of Information Act request filed by Jason Leopold of BuzzFeed News. He asked for any and all emails between national security journalists and the CIA's Office of Public Affairs. And what he received in that tranche of information was evidence that Ken Delanian, who is the head national security journalist for NBC News and MSNBC, had been writing articles about the CIA and then sending them to the CIA for clearance and comment before sending them to his own editor. That's not journalism, that's propaganda. And we've come to realize that that's actually quite common here in the United States. Now, you can blame the fact that major news outlets don't have a budget for investigative reporting. You can make whatever excuse you want. But propaganda is propaganda, and it's never, ever appropriate in a democracy. The only way to combat that is if the congressional oversight committees, that is the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Intelligence Committee, truly exercised oversight. That is, kept the CIA within the confines of the law, which they haven't done. They haven't done it since the 90s. You know, I challenged one Democratic senator, Ron Wyden. Ron Wyden is a Democrat of Oregon, and he has a reputation as being one of the good guys. He'll occasionally say the right thing about Julian. He'll say the right thing about torture. And I challenged him when I got out of prison. And I said, Senator, I got to tell you, I was very disappointed that you didn't really stand up for me. I expected more from you. And he became very defensive. And he said, look, it took all of my energy just to not lose my security clearance. And that was a revelatory minute for me, because I realized that even the so-called good guys are afraid of the CIA. They're afraid to call the CIA out on its illegality because they'll lose their security clearance. Well, it should be the other way around. The CIA should be afraid of the oversight committees. The CIA should be having conversations at headquarters akin to, well, maybe we shouldn't do this operation because Congress wouldn't approve. Maybe we shouldn't do this assassination because, frankly, it's illegal and we don't want Congress to come down on us. But those are not conversations that are taking place at CIA headquarters. So we need to really push our elected officials here to do the jobs, frankly, that they were elected to do. Otherwise, the CIA runs the country.
Thank you, John.
Can I just compliment on this? I think it's just very important that, because we're still by and large assuming in democracies that we as voters who are actually electing our representatives in parliament, we have any kind of leverage over these people. But when we look at who is financing their election campaigns, it's not our tax money really, it is donations from powerful industries. In many countries, the industries provide staff to members of parliament to write, proposals for legislation and so on. So what it means, really, let's be honest about it, is that our legislative power has been privatized. And now they very often elect ministers or appoint ministers and members of government. So that means the executive is also privatized. And then they also appoint judges, or the government appoints judges depending on the system. But it means that the three powers have been privatized. And then if we say that large portions of the media, are the property, private property, basically, are owned by private individuals, the same industries again, or they're owned indirectly through, again, as I said before, the dependence of those media outlets on commercials, revenues and so on. Then all four powers in the state have been privatized. It means that we are no longer, de facto, we're no longer a democracy. Mm-hmm. And this is what this is about.
So very, very powerful, very important topic, and that's laid out brilliantly, I think, Niels. Sarah, do you have any last thoughts? Anything you'd like to say to people watching tonight?
Yes, so first of all, I'm thrilled to be in the panel with amazing people with very impressive life experience and conscience, because it's not enough to have life experience if you don't have a conscience and if you don't share with the generosity to share. So, so when I thought about the Assange case, you have some very spontaneous associations that comes into your mind. And the more I read about this case, it totally changed my perceptions about the world and gave me many answers and a vocabulary that was missing. And that was liberating for me. So this Assange case, listen to people talking about the Assange case, it told me in real time the history of my time that maybe posterity will read and analyze. So it just inserted me in this present in a very violent and real way, in violence, not in the sense without any protections. And that was very liberating for me. And one of the scenes that came into my mind was in this film, the last film from Stanley Kubrick, Eyes Wide Shut. You have this main character who finds himself in the middle of a very, very unsettling experience. So he enters uninvited in a mansion where powerful people, a powerful secret society performs like a cult orgy. And all of them in attendance, they are wearing masks, very impenetrable masks and cloaks, and sex slaves are obeying very strict commands of an hierarchy, and dissent could cost anyone there their own lives. And once they've spotted this intruder, who is Dr. Bill, it's a phonetic allusion to Dollar Bill, like this guy who wants to belong so badly and wants the social essentials so badly, and he doesn't really understand what he's getting into. So once he's spotted in the secret ritual, it immediately stops, and the lights falls on him in this very dark room. The music stops, and he's ashamed, he's blamed, he's humiliated, and he's put into his place by having to take off his mask and his clothes. So they're kind of suggesting him that he will be gang raped. So I think this powerful imagery that came so spontaneously to mind, for me, suggests in a way that a ruling class that is operating in the shadows of society and subjugating individuals. And they will do whatever it takes to maintain this hierarchy that legitimates and keep hidden all their depravities. And I think what makes this men truly, truly powerful is the fact that we don't know who they are. They get to be invisible, and they perverse their deeds and pretend they to be inexistent to the external world. It becomes just in this small room, and they can do whatever they want with impunity, and sometimes even they are awarded for it. So I think this ordinary Struder is not important enough to be visible. He must take off his mask for everyone to see him. But at the same time, he cannot see who is ruling him. And I think he's confused and unable, he becomes unable to distinguish reality and fantasy, and the rational and the irrational. And he's left to obey this rule that he is unaware of and that he doesn't totally comprehend. And this power structure relies exactly on that, on the docile obedience of those who are constrained, either voluntarily or intimidated, just like Niels Melson mentioned and John mentioned. And they will play along to keep this deep, dark bottom line underworld hidden. And I think Julian Assange told us the uncensored story of our times. He is the guy who ripped off all the masks. He didn't operating under the fantasy name Deep State. He gave a name to the Deep State. He said, look, these people have full identity addresses, national insurance number, company numbers. Those are their conversations. Those are their crimes. They are not an abstract idea, and their perverse intents and their unsatiable greed was there for the world to see. And Assange even went farther. He gave dignity to those that anonymously were killed and died in the war crimes and the torture. They were anonymously detained. They were silenced. They had their life destroyed, their future destroyed. And I think he decrypted for posterity the understanding, for instance, that September 11 was nothing then to inaugurate the possibility of an unprecedented mass surveillance and suppression of our fundamental rights. And I think everyone who joins the cause of Assange wants one thing in common. We want clear-cut justice for the eyes to see. And justice means not only Julian Assange free. This begins with Julian Assange free, but it ends with a trial of those hidden behind those masks and committing crimes. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, Sarah. Very, very vivid imagery there. And John, what's the importance of the Assange case to you, and what would you like to say?
The Assange case. I don't think we can overstate the importance of the Assange case, not just because of the obvious human rights concerns that it presents to all of us, but here in the United States, a conviction of Julian Assange, an extradition even of Julian Assange, would open the floodgates of prosecution. Every national security journalist in America would be liable for prosecution under the Espionage Act just for doing his or her job. And one of the things that so many people forget is an espionage charge here in the United States sometimes carries with it the death penalty. Those of us who have been charged with espionage were looking at dying in prison, and first in In fact, in the first conversation I had, or my attorneys had with the Justice Department when I was arrested after blowing the whistle on the CIA's torture program, the Justice Department offered me, from the kindness of their hearts, 45 years in prison. And one of the attorneys there said, "Take the deal, Mr. Kyriakou, and you might live to meet your grandchildren." Well, imagine if every national security journalist was liable for a sentence like that just for doing journalism. Again, I said in the very beginning of this conversation that it is against the law in the United States to classify a crime, but much of what the intelligence community does is a crime. And so it's the job of national security journalists to expose these crimes. 9/11 was a disaster in so many different ways, but in my view, the most disastrous thing that came out of it was a public worship of the intelligence community and the inability or unwillingness of Americans, average Americans and elected officials, to question anything that the intelligence community does. We've set ourselves back generations in this country. And all of this hinges on Julian Assange and his case.
Thank you, John. And
Thank you.
Niels, are you optimistic about the future for Assange, for the result of this case?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I mean, I've investigated this case in what has happened in the last 10 years, and unless something major happens, a game changer comes in, it's going to be very difficult to prevent that extradition from going forward, because this is not about the law. It's never been about the law. In none of those proceedings, it's been about the law. It's been a political show trial all along. And so whatever the law says, it never works in his favor. And so why would it now, right? Let's be real about this. But on the other hand, I also see that increasingly the public is becoming aware, the journalist community becomes aware of the paramount importance of this case. Again, not only for the freedom of press, because, as I said, it's the last bastion against the return of absolutist rule. And please believe me, I've not known for exaggerating things in the last 20 years. This is absolutely true. It's a dramatic statement, but it's true. This is what this case is about. You know what we can see? It's not just about the US and its Espionage Act. I mean, the British judge who initially, in January, refused to extradite Assange, she went to great lengths to wade through every single legal argument that the US has made, and to add on top of it to say what Julian Assange has done is not only a crime under the Espionage Act, it's also a crime under the Official Secrets Act of the UK. So, and the Official Secrets Act of the UK has stood example for a plethora of official secret acts in Commonwealth countries. So that's enormous. And now, just incidentally, a week ago, the Swedish government, that we consider to be progressive and whatever, they have just proposed to their own parliament to criminalize what Julian Assange has done, officially, to criminalize. And so the disclosure of classified information, and now watch the criteria, not only if it threatens national security, but only if it could, it could disturb the relations between Sweden and another state or an international organization. Basically, I mean, what's that supposed to mean? They want to criminalize that. So what I want to say, this is a global trend, and states governments are waiting, the US government, but Sweden is just waiting for him to be extradited and to be, for them to go forward with similar things. And I'm sure there's other countries as well. So this is really a global challenge. It's a global case. It's really that one case that might decide, whether we'll have to take another tour to a dark age of absolutist rule.
Thank you, Niels. I think that explains the global, very deep significance and importance of the case. I think for me, one thing I've noticed is that the case of Assange has gathered together so many experts from so many fields, lawyers, journalists, but academics, but also activists, journalists and ordinary people. It's become a huge movement to campaign for justice and freedom for Julian Assange. So I think that's at least one positive thing that is coming out of this entire process, is that people are starting to realize these things. And I think I'd like to thank our panelists today, Sarah Vivacqua, John Kiriakou and Professor Niels Meltzer. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand this case, its implications, its significance, and people can go online to journalistsupport.net to find out more about the Journalist Support Committee and campaigns for Assange and other journalists that are suffering persecution and torture. Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.